Jim Crow was alive and well in the 30s on the shore.
The threat to blacks on the shore was magnified by anger over the case of Ewell Lee, a black man also known as Orphan Jones. In January of 1932, Lee was convicted of murdering a white family of 4 in Berlin. Lee's lawyer was Bernard Adis, a communist from Baltimore. He not only got Lee's original conviction reversed, but managed to drag the case on for years, infuriating whites.
He was despised on the lower shore, even though he was a tremendously effective defense attorney for his client.
In October of 1933, the Lee case was still unresolved when an elderly woman named Mary Denston said she was attacked by a black man while walking home near Princess Anne. She said she didn't know her assailant, but would be able to identify him among 1,000. Word of the attack spread quickly. Soon, hundreds of men from 3 counties joined the manhunt. The man they were hunting was George Armwood, a 22-year-old farm worker who lived near Pocomoke City. When he was 15, George left school to live and work with a white man on a nearby farm. Armwood, the Afro learned, was reared by a white family and recognized by many to be feeble-minded and a fit subject for a psychopathic ward. He was not put in one because, in spite of his mental infirmity, or because of it, he was a good workman and an inexpensive one. Even before Mrs. Denston had a chance to identify him, Armwood was named as her attacker. It's not clear why.
I'm not sure that Armwood committed a crime at all. From what we know, and the fact that he was described as being dim-witted, I'm not sure if he committed a crime. When you're looking for someone to blame for something, you find a scapegoat. The weakest victim, the weakest person you can find, and you choose that person.
Whatever the reason, Armwood was a wanted man. The search intensified, and the next day, an armed posse entered the Armwood home, demanding to know where George was.
And then they started threatening them, telling them that if, they didn't give him up, and if they knew where he was, that they would hurt all of them. Eventually, they seen him being drugged out of the woods. And she said that they pulled him out and they were beating on him, and then they tied him to the back of a car and made him walk.
In a time of anxiety and anger, Armwood's capture was like lighting a fuse.
The Ewell Lee case was still very much in the headlines, but here comes George Armwood, another African American accused of a crime against a white woman.
They had just lynched Matt Williams 2 years prior to. And then also the people in Worcester County were still in uproar because what happened to Ewell Lee, called Orphan Jones, because it took 2 years before he was brought to justice, and they wanted it to happen immediately.
Armwood was first taken to the Princess Anne jail, but fearing trouble, police took him to the Wicomico jail in Salisbury, the very place where Matthew Williams was lynched not 2 years earlier. As news of Armwood's capture spread, angry crowds began to gather. It was clear he wasn't safe in Salisbury either, so Governor Albert Ritchie ordered state police to take Armwood away from the shore altogether. Just as Armwood was let out the back door, the mob burst through the front. From Salisbury, Armwood was taken first to Cecil County and then to the Baltimore City Jail, where it was reported he signed a confession. In Baltimore, Armwood was out of the reach of shore mobs, but the respite was short-lived.
Judge Robert Dewar ordered that Armwood be returned to the Somerset County Jail after he had been assured by Sheriff Luther Daugherty and by State's Attorney John Robbins that they had everything under control. I could not understand why Judge Dewar would do such a thing because he was a circuit court judge. He wasn't a law enforcement officer. I found out later from his granddaughter that Judge Dewar was up for re-election the next fall.
Robbins told Ritchie the danger of violence had passed. He said Somerset County is law-abiding and peaceful. Judge Dewar also assured the governor, but he may have been more concerned with assuring his constituents.
Judge Dewar realized that if he didn't bring Armwood back, it would be considered a repudiation of his own community. So to his shame, he had him come back.
Ritchie also faced re-election, so he agreed, and at 10 o'clock that night, a convoy of state police left Baltimore with Armwood in tow. When the sun came up on October 18th, George Armwood was sitting in a cell at the Princess Anne jail. Everyone on the shore knew it. His return was trumpeted in the papers and on the radio. Predictably, the jail attracted the curious and the furious. People arrived by the hundreds. The danger was clear and growing. The troopers who brought Armwood back stayed to guard the jail, but there were only 25, and the mob now numbered in the thousands. The American Legion refused to provide reinforcements, and Robbins refused to allow Armwood to be returned to Baltimore. Reports of unrest soon reached the governor. Again, Ritchie called Robbins and Dewar, and again each man assured him that Armwood was safe. But with every minute, the mob was getting larger and more menacing. At 7 o'clock, Dewar went to the jail himself to talk to the angry crowd.
The judge confronted the mob and said, "I know all of you. I know most of you. Now, let's just go home. We're going to try him and let the law take its course."
And there were shouts from the mob, well, what if ATIS comes over? There was this prevailing attitude in the lower shore that if something was not done quickly, this lawyer ATIS will do the same thing here that he did in Worcester County, and we're not going to have that.
After speaking to the mob, Dewar got back in his car and left for dinner, thinking the crisis was over. He was mistaken. No sooner had the judge left when the crowd advanced at the badly outnumbered troopers. As they surged forward, the police closed ranks at the jail entrance. Rocks and bricks started flying. The police answered with tear gas. The smoke had the desired effect, but was quickly dispersed by the wind, and the crowd, still growing in number and frenzy, pressed in. The police were armed but never fired a shot. Instead, there was hand-to-hand combat at the entrance. Some men brought heavy rails and rammed the gate repeatedly until it finally gave way at 8:30. A howl arose from the mob when the gate went down. Armwood was found hiding under the mattress in his cell on the second floor. He was dragged outside, a noose already around his neck. The frenzied mob taunted and beat the helpless prisoner. A boy of 18 cut Armwood's ear off and waved it around. It was described as a bloody carnival in which men, women, and even children took part.
Yes, it was a family affair. It wasn't just men, but it was women. And they knew in advance what was going to happen.
To show their contempt for Dewar, they dragged Armwood behind the truck to the judge's home, hoping to hang him there. One estimate put the size of the mob at 5,000 people, almost 6 times the population of Princess Anne itself. Finding no suitable tree at Judge Dewar's home, they chose a tall oak nearby. The mob shrieked as they yanked Armwood up and let him drop several times. Then they let him hang for 5 minutes. When they cut him down, Armwood was dead, but the spectacle wasn't over. Finally, Armwood's body was dragged to the courthouse. It was doused with gasoline and set afire. The crowd was so deep, the police couldn't get through. A visitor described the stench of burning flesh, and a mob of men, women, boys, and girls dancing and singing around the burning body as if in celebration. The rope was cut into small pieces and given away as souvenirs. Armwood's charred body was finally dumped in front of a lumberyard where it lay in the street for hours. It became an iconic image memorialized on the front page of the Afro-American newspapers. a young reporter named Clarence Mitchell Jr. was sent to the scene.
When we got down there, the crowd was there. They had actually completed the lynching at the time, but the body was
They shoot him or hang him?
They hanged and then poured gasoline on the body and set it on fire. And it was right out there in the middle of the street.
How'd you feel though when you saw this?
Well, it was a revolting sight. There's no doubt about that. I see a fellow human lying there in the middle of the street in that kind of a condition.
Here's how Mitchell described the scene in print.
The skin of George Armwood was scorched and blackened, while his face had suffered many blows from sharp and heavy instruments. A cursory glance revealed that one ear was missing, and his tongue between his clenched teeth gave evidence of his great agony before death. There is no adequate description of the mute evidence of gloating on the part of whites who gathered to watch the effect upon our people.
Mary Denston never did identify Armwood as her assailant, yet thousands of people took part in his murder, which was enabled by a few.
This was what Judge Dewar, he and the governor at the time were complicit in. They represented the establishment, and they didn't think a black man's life was worth anything.
For his part, Governor Ritchie responded with outrage, saying, "I am shocked beyond expression at this horrible lynching."
It's a little disingenuous of Ritchie to claim that he didn't know that there was a possibility that this would occur. Anyone with any knowledge of previous events knew that this was a great risk.
Ritchie placed responsibility for the lynching squarely on the shoulders of Judge Dewar and State's Attorney Robbins.
So there was a clear effort on the governor's part to place the blame on other men as opposed to taking that responsibility himself.
Judge Dewar admitted, "I was badly mistaken in my judgment, and I am deeply grieved that such a thing happened in our county." His remorse was met with skepticism by the Baltimore press. Robbins, on the other hand, was mum. To the many questions he faced, he had but one response: "I have no statement to make at this time." Newspapers around the country registered disbelief and disgust at the events in Maryland. It was a stain on the state and its governor. Under fire, Ritchie ordered Attorney General Lane to investigate the crime at once. 9 suspects were identified, but in Maryland at that time, charges could only be brought by the county state's attorney, and Robbins refused to arrest anyone.
So the governor actually, in effect, declared martial law, sent the Maryland militia to Salisbury, to the armory in Salisbury, where they fanned out and actually apprehended 4 alleged leaders of the lynch mob.
The locals were incensed and gathered at the armory trying to intimidate the troops and prevent the arrests. They didn't succeed. The 4 men were rushed to Baltimore and were returned to the shore to face charges.
State's Attorney Robbins said, "Judge, I don't have any evidence against these men, so I've got nothing to charge them with," whereupon the judge dismissed the case. So the Armwood lynching, just as the Matthew Williams lynching, went without anyone being charged.